The glass doors of the restaurant opened with a soft chime, letting in a gush of cold evening air. The laughter of a family filled the space, turning a few heads momentarily. There they stood, a cheerful group of four, exuding warmth that seemed to momentarily brighten the cozy ambiance of the restaurant. At the forefront was the father, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and a casual blazer. His confident stride and easy smile hinted at a man accustomed to leading his family with love and pride. Beside him the mother adjusted her purse on her shoulder, her elegance understated yet undeniable. Her soft chuckle at something her younger son had whispered spoke of her nurturing, joyful spirit. The children followed close behind. The older one, a teenage girl, with bright eyes and curly hair, walked with an air of youthful curiosity, her phone clutched in her hand, but forgotten in the moment. Beside her, the younger boy, no older than 8, clung to his mother's side, his wide grin revealing the gap of a missing tooth. He held a colorful toy car in one hand, spinning its wheels absent-mindedly sat Dot. The restaurant was alive with energy. The soft clinking of cutlery against fine china blended with the murmur of conversations and the occasional burst of laughter. Waiters weaved through the tables with practiced precision, balancing trays laden with steaming dishes and sparkling glasses. Warm golden lights cascaded from chandeliers, casting a soft glow over the neatly arranged tables. Each table was adorned with crisp white tablecloths and small vases holding fresh flowers, their gentle fragrance mingling with the aroma of rich sauces and baked bread. A few tables were occupied by couples engrossed in quiet conversations, while others hosted groups of friends sharing animated stories. As the family stepped further in, their excitement was palpable. "Wow, this place looks amazing," the teenage daughter whispered, her eyes scanning the elegant decor. Her younger brother, less interested in the decor, pointed toward a dessert cart brimming with cakes and pastries near the counter. "Let's find our table, kids," the father said, his voice carrying a warm authority. The mother nodded in agreement, her eyes already searching for the host. The restaurant staff moved like a well-oiled machine. The maitre d', a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, approached them with a welcoming smile. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his tone polite and professional. "Yes, we do," the father replied, giving the man their name. The maitre d' checked his list and gestured toward a table near the window. "This way, please," he said, leading them through the maze of tables. The family followed, their footsteps muffled against the plush carpet. They passed diners immersed in their meals, the hum of conversation a steady backdrop. A few heads turned as they walked by, not out of malice, but out of mild curiosity at their evident joy. The table by the window was perfect. It offered a view of the city lights twinkling in the distance, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The father pulled out a chair for his wife, while the children slid into their seats, still buzzing with excitement. As they settled in, the mother leaned over to the teenage daughter. "This is going to be a lovely evening," she said, softly, her voice filled with genuine happiness. The boy, now focused on the menu, whispered, "Can we get dessert first?" His sister rolled her eyes playfully, and their father laughed. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. The family was together, happy and ready to create another cherished memory. But unknown to them, the evening ahead would hold moments they never anticipated. The family had just started to settle in, their excitement visible as they glanced over the menu. The father leaned closer to his wife, discussing the options, while the children animatedly pointed out dishes they wanted to try. Their laughter and chatter created a warm bubble of joy at their table, momentarily cutting through the general hum of the restaurant. Not far away, a waiter stood by the counter observing the family with a slightly raised brow. His name tag read Greg, and though his uniform was immaculate, his expression carried a hint of discontent. He adjusted his tie unnecessarily, as if buying time before approaching their table. With a deep breath, Greg finally grabbed his notepad and walked toward the family, his steps deliberate. As he reached their table, his posture stiffened and his smile barely touched his lips. "Good evening," he said, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. "Welcome. Are you ready to order, or do you need more time?" The father looked up and smiled, oblivious to the undertone in Greg's voice. "We're almost ready, but could you please tell us about your specials?" Greg sighed softly, though loud enough to be noticed. "They're all written right there," he said, tapping the bottom of the menu with his pen. "But I can repeat them if you didn't catch that." His tone carried a faint edge, the words wrapped in a layer of mock politeness. The mother glanced at her husband, her brows slightly furrowed, but the father remained calm. "Thank you. We'll take a moment," he replied evenly. Greg gave a curt nod and turned on his heel, heading back to the counter. As he reached it, a fellow waiter approached him. "Table 3 needs water," the colleague said. "I'll get to it," Greg replied dismissively, his eyes flicking back to the family. "They look like they're here for a photo shoot, not dinner," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Meanwhile, the family continued to enjoy their moment. The father reassured his wife, sensing her unease. "Let's not let this ruin our evening," he said softly, placing a comforting hand on hers. Greg returned a few minutes later, his forced smile now more transparent. "So, ready to order?" he asked, his voice sharp. The teenage daughter was the first to respond. "I'd like the pasta, please. And can I have it without mushrooms?" Greg jotted it down without looking up. "That's extra," he said flatly. The girl hesitated, caught off guard. "Oh, okay. That's fine," she said softly. The mother stepped in next. "I'll have the grilled salmon," she said, her tone measured. Greg raised a brow. "That's one of our more expensive dishes," he said, his words laced with subtle judgment. The father's smile faltered slightly, but quickly recovered. "That's all right, and I'll have the steak, medium rare." Greg scribbled it down quickly, not bothering to confirm the order. When the young boy enthusiastically said, "And I want a cheeseburger," Greg finally looked up, an expression of mild disdain crossing his face. "We don't do kids' meals here. You'll have to pick something from the adult menu." The boy looked confused, his excitement dampened. "Oh, okay. Fries then?" he stammered. Greg barely nodded. "Fries, sure," he said, his tone dismissive. He closed his notepad with a snap and walked off without another word. The mother exchanged a concerned glance with the father. "That was odd," she said softly. The father took a deep breath. "Let's give him the benefit of the doubt," he said, trying to keep the mood light for the children's sake. At the counter, Greg seemed to transform entirely as he approached another table. It was occupied by a well-dressed couple chatting over glasses of wine. "Ah, Mr. and Mrs. Harper." Greg greeted them warmly, his smile now genuine and charming. "It's great to see you again. Let me guess, the filet mignon for you, sir, and the lobster bisque for the lady?" The couple laughed, clearly comfortable with Greg's familiarity. "You know us too well, Greg," Mr. Harper said. Greg chuckled. "Only the best for my favorite guests," he replied, jotting down their order with enthusiasm. This stark contrast didn't go unnoticed by the Black family. The teenage daughter leaned toward her mother. "He seems different with them," she whispered, her voice tinged with confusion. The mother placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's arm. "It's okay, sweetie," she said, though her own unease was evident. Back at the counter, Greg lingered with the Harpers, engaging them in cheerful small talk. When he finally returned to the Black family's table, his demeanor had reverted. "Your food will take some time," he said briskly, not bothering to explain or apologize for the delay. Before anyone could respond, he walked away again, his back straight, and his pace hurried, as if eager to escape their presence. The father glanced at his wife and children, his smile now faint. "Let's just focus on us," he said softly, his voice steady. "We're here together. That's all that matters." Unbeknownst to the family, Greg's behavior was starting to attract the attention of a few other customers. At a nearby table, a young couple exchanged a look. "Did you see how he just walked away from them?" the woman asked her partner. "Yeah," the man replied, frowning. "That's not okay." The murmurs of observation and concern didn't reach Greg, who seemed oblivious to the growing discomfort around him. For the Black family, however, the tension at their table was palpable. Their initial excitement had dimmed, replaced by an unspoken understanding that this meal might not go as smoothly as they had hoped. The family sat quietly at their table, the once vibrant energy now muted. The father scanned the restaurant with a practiced calm, his expression unreadable. Beside him, the mother took a sip of water, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her glass. Her silence spoke volumes, words she chose not to say aloud for the sake of her children. "Mom, why was he so different with us?" the teenage daughter finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was low but carried a mixture of confusion and hurt. The mother glanced at her, her expression softening. "What do you mean, sweetie?" she replied, though her tone hinted that she already knew the answer. The girl hesitated, then gestured subtly toward the waiter, who was now laughing at a joke shared with another table. "With them?" she said, her voice almost a whisper. "He seemed so nice. Why wasn't he like that with us?" The mother exchanged a glance with her husband, a silent conversation passing between them. "People can be complicated," the father said gently, leaning forward to meet his daughter's gaze. "Sometimes their actions don't make sense." The boy, who had been fidgeting with his toy car, looked up. "Did we do something wrong, Dad?" he asked, his wide eyes filled with innocent concern. The father's composure faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "Of course not," he said firmly, his voice carrying a warmth that reassured his son. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people act a certain way, and it has nothing to do with us." The boy nodded slowly, though his confusion lingered. "But he didn't even look at me when I ordered," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The mother reached across the table, placing her hand over her son's. "You're right, and that wasn't okay," she said softly. "But you know what? That doesn't change who we are. We don't let other people's behavior decide how we feel about ourselves." The teenage daughter leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "It's just not fair," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the menu she wasn't reading. "We didn't even do anything, and he's treating us like we don't belong here." The father sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of a conversation he wished he didn't have to have. "You're right. It's not fair," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But we can't control how other people act. What we can control is how we respond." The mother nodded in agreement. "And we respond with grace," she said, her tone firm yet gentle, "because we know who we are, and we don't need anyone else's approval to feel proud of that." The girl's expression softened slightly, though a shadow of doubt remained. "I guess," she said, her voice reluctant. Across the restaurant, the waiter's cheerful banter with another table reached their ears, a stark reminder of the difference in his behavior. The mother noticed her son's gaze lingering on the waiter and gently turned his attention back to the table. "How about we play a game while we wait for our food?" she suggested, her smile bright but slightly forced. "What game?" the boy asked, his curiosity piqued. The mother thought for a moment. "Let's guess what the chef is making in the kitchen right now," she said. "Whoever gets closest gets to pick dessert." The idea seemed to lift the boy's spirits. "Okay, I think they're making spaghetti," he exclaimed, his enthusiasm returning. The father smiled, grateful for his wife's quick thinking. "Good guess," he said. "I'm going to say roast chicken." The teenage daughter rolled her eyes, but joined in. "I'll go with pizza," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For a few moments the tension at the table eased, replaced by laughter and playful guesses. But the shadow of the waiter's behavior still loomed, unspoken, but deeply felt. As the game wound down, the father leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the restaurant once more. He noticed a few patrons glancing in their direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and sympathy. One woman at a nearby table caught his eye and gave him a small, encouraging smile. He nodded in acknowledgment, appreciating the silent gesture. The mother noticed too, but chose not to comment. Instead, she reached for her glass and took another sip, her thoughts racing. She knew these moments were opportunities to teach her children resilience and pride, but the weight of having to do so was exhausting. The boy broke the silence again. "Mom, do you think the owner will come to our table?" he asked innocently. The question caught her off guard. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" she said. He shrugged. "I just think maybe the owner could tell the waiter to be nicer," he said simply, his logic pure and unfiltered. The father and mother exchanged another glance, this time tinged with a bittersweet humor. "Maybe," the father said, his tone gentle, "but we don't need anyone else to stand up for us. We can handle this as a family." The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer, though his sister remained quiet, her thoughts still circling. Time seemed to move slowly as they waited for their food. The waiter passed their table several times, his demeanor unchanged, though he didn't spare them a glance. Each time the father noticed, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The mother leaned over to her daughter, breaking the silence. "You know," she said softly, "these moments don't define us. What defines us is how we choose to carry ourselves." The girl looked up, her expression thoughtful. "I know, Mom," she said after a pause, "but sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, it's not enough." The mother placed a hand on her daughter's cheek, her gaze steady. "It's always enough," she said firmly, "because we are enough. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." The girl nodded slowly, her mother's words sinking in. As their food finally arrived, the family took a collective breath, preparing to focus on their meal and each other. They knew the evening wasn't turning out the way they had hoped, but their bond remained unshaken, a quiet testament to their strength and resilience. The soft clinking of glasses and the hum of quiet conversations surrounded the family as they waited patiently for their food. Despite their earlier unease, they focused on each other, trying to make the best of the evening. The father occasionally glanced at his watch, noting that it had been a considerable amount of time since they placed their order. Meanwhile, Greg, the waiter, was leaning casually against the counter, scrolling on his phone. His colleagues bustled around him, delivering dishes and refilling drinks, but he seemed unconcerned. The Black family's order sat on the kitchen pass, the dishes slowly cooling under the warming lights. The father finally decided to catch Greg's attention. Raising his hand slightly, he called out, "Excuse me?" Greg looked up from his phone, his expression irritated. With a slow, exaggerated sigh, he pushed himself off the counter and strolled over to the table. "Yes?" he asked, his tone clipped and impatient. The father smiled politely, masking his growing frustration. "It's been quite a while. Is our food ready?" Greg shrugged. "The kitchen's busy tonight," he said, not bothering to glance at the kitchen. "It'll get here when it gets here." The mother frowned slightly. "We noticed other tables being served already," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Well, maybe those tables didn't order anything complicated," Greg replied, his words sharp. "You'll just have to wait." Before anyone could respond, Greg turned and walked away, leaving the family stunned. The teenage daughter leaned closer to her mother, whispering, "He didn't even check the kitchen." The mother nodded subtly, her jaw tightening. She placed a hand on her daughter's arm, silently reassuring her to stay calm. Minutes later, Greg finally brought their food. He set the plates down with little care, the clatter of dishes echoing louder than necessary. "Here you go," he said, his tone indifferent. The teenage daughter frowned as she looked at her plate. "This has mushrooms," she said quietly, glancing at Greg. "I asked for no mushrooms." Greg rolled his eyes. "Did you? Well, I guess the kitchen missed that. You can just pick them off," he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. The girl looked at her mother, who gave her a reassuring nod. "It's okay, sweetheart," the mother said softly, her voice steady despite her growing frustration. The younger boy stared at his plate, confused. "I didn't order this," he said, pointing at the dish in front of him. Greg glanced at the plate. "Well, it's what you're getting," he said flatly. "We don't have time to make changes tonight." The father straightened in his chair, his expression calm, but his voice firm. "This is not what we ordered," he said evenly. Greg shrugged again. "The kitchen's busy," he repeated. "Take it or leave it." The boy's eyes filled with tears, his excitement from earlier completely gone. The father placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. The family exchanged glances, their frustration unspoken but shared. The teenage daughter pushed her plate aside, her appetite gone. The mother reached across the table, holding her husband's hand tightly for support. At a nearby table, a couple watched the scene unfold. The woman leaned toward her partner. "Did you hear how he spoke to them?" she asked, her voice low but filled with indignation. "I did," the man replied, frowning. "It's not right." Despite their discomfort, the couple remained seated, glancing occasionally at Greg, but making no move to intervene. Around the restaurant, other patrons also noticed Greg's behavior. Some exchanged uneasy looks, while others simply focused on their own meals, unwilling to get involved. Greg returned to the counter, muttering under his breath. "Can't believe I have to deal with this tonight," he said to a fellow waiter. "What's wrong?" the other waiter asked. "Table by the window," Greg replied, jerking his thumb in the family's direction. "Acting like they own the place, complaining about everything." The other waiter glanced at the family and then back at Greg, his expression disapproving. "They don't look like they're causing any trouble," he said. "Maybe you're just reading them wrong." Greg scoffed. "Yeah, right," he said, rolling his eyes. "Just wait. They'll probably ask to speak to the manager next." Back at the table, the family tried to continue their meal, but the tension lingered. The teenage daughter kept glancing at Greg, her frustration evident. "Why does he hate us?" she whispered. The father shook his head. "It's not about us, sweetheart," he said gently. "Sometimes people let their own problems affect how they treat others." The boy poked at his food, his earlier excitement now replaced with a quiet sadness. "I don't want to eat this," he mumbled. The mother leaned closer to him. "It's okay," she said softly. "We'll fix this, I promise." Greg walked past their table again, his steps slowing slightly as he glanced at their plates. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone dripping with insincerity. The father met his gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "We'd like to speak with the manager," he said. Greg smirked. "Figures," he muttered under his breath. "I'll let them know." As Greg walked away, the family sat silently, their unity unshaken, but their evening undeniably soured. Around them, the murmur of the restaurant continued, the other patrons returning to their conversations. The woman from the nearby table leaned toward her partner again. "I hope the manager does something about this," she said. "Me too," he replied. "It's just hard to watch." Unaware of the growing unease in the restaurant, Greg returned to the counter, his expression smug. "They want to see the manager," he said to another waiter, his tone mocking. "Guess they think they're special." The clock above the bar ticked steadily as the dinner rush began to wind down. In the corner of the restaurant, the owner, Mr. Harris, sat at a small office desk tucked behind a glass wall. He was a man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair, dressed sharply in a tailored vest and shirt. His reputation as a fair and attentive leader preceded him, and it was clear he took pride in the restaurant he had built from scratch. As he reviewed the evening's reports, his pen hovered over the pages. He paused occasionally to glance out the glass wall, surveying the bustling dining area. The golden lights reflected warmly against the polished wood, and the soft hum of chatter filled the air. But something caught his attention, a subtle tension radiating from a particular table near the window. His eyes lingered on the Black family seated there. Their table seemed unusually quiet, the mother offering a small, strained smile to her son, the father calmly patting the boy's shoulder. The teenage daughter sat with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on her barely touched plate. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see one of his senior waitstaff, a young woman named Elena, standing there with a worried expression. "Mr. Harris," she began hesitantly, stepping inside. "Yes, Elena?" he asked, setting his pen down. "It's about Greg," she said, glancing nervously toward the dining area. "I think he's been treating one of the tables poorly tonight. The family by the window. They seem really upset." Mr. Harris frowned slightly. "Did they complain to you?" "No," Elena admitted. "But I've been watching, and it's clear something isn't right. I heard him make a rude comment when they asked about their food, and he hasn't been giving them the same attention as other tables." The frown on Mr. Harris's face deepened. He trusted Elena's observations. She had worked with him long enough to know the standards he expected from his team. "I'll handle it," he said, rising from his chair. His tone was calm, but there was a resolve in his voice that left no room for doubt. As Mr. Harris stepped into the dining area, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who commanded respect without demanding it. He took a moment to survey the scene, his sharp eyes noting Greg leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone, while the family sat at their table, visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Harris approached the counter first. "Greg," he said evenly. Greg startled slightly, hastily pocketing his phone. "Oh, Mr. Harris," he said, his voice suddenly polite. "I didn't see you there." "Clearly," Mr. Harris replied, his tone neutral but firm. "How's everything going tonight?" Greg hesitated, glancing toward the family's table for a brief moment. "Busy as usual," he said quickly. Mr. Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he followed Greg's gaze and watched as the young boy at the family's table pushed his plate aside, his shoulders slumping in disappointment. The father leaned over, speaking to him softly, while the mother reached for her daughter's hand. "Have you been attending to the family by the window?" Mr. Harris asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, of course," he said. "They're a bit demanding, but I've been managing." "Demanding?" Mr. Harris echoed, raising an eyebrow. Greg nodded quickly. "They've been complaining about everything. First the order, then the timing. It's just been one thing after another." Mr. Harris regarded him silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said finally. "Why don't you take a break? I'll handle their table for now." Greg hesitated, unsure if this was a reprimand or a reprieve. "Sure, Mr. Harris," he said, stepping back reluctantly. As Greg walked away, Mr. Harris approached the family's table. His presence was unassuming yet authoritative, and the warmth in his expression immediately set the family at ease. "Good evening," he said with a kind smile, addressing the father. "I'm Mr. Harris, the owner of the restaurant. I wanted to personally check on your experience tonight." The father looked up, momentarily caught off guard by the owner's approach. "Good evening, Mr. Harris," he said, his voice polite but cautious. "Thank you for checking in." Mr. Harris pulled a chair from a nearby empty table and sat down, leaning slightly forward to meet their eye level. "I noticed you seemed a bit uncomfortable," he said gently. "Is everything all right?" The father hesitated, glancing at his wife. She gave him a subtle nod, encouraging him to speak. "We've had a few issues with our server tonight," the father admitted. "The service has been slower than expected, and some of the comments made were less than professional." Mr. Harris nodded, his expression serious but understanding. "I see," he said. "First, let me sincerely apologize for any unpleasantness you've experienced. That is not how we do things here." The teenage daughter spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "He didn't even care when I asked for no mushrooms. He told me to just pick them off." The boy chimed in, his voice small. "And he gave me the wrong food," he said, his eyes downcast. The mother added, her tone measured, "We're not looking to cause trouble, Mr. Harris. We just wanted to have a nice family dinner." Mr. Harris's heart sank as he listened. He nodded slowly, his expression resolute. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," he said. "You're not causing trouble at all. In fact, I'm grateful that you're being honest with me. It gives me the chance to make things right." He stood up and motioned for Elena, who had been observing from a distance. "Elena, please have the kitchen remake their orders, exactly as they requested, and have it expedited," he said, "and add a dessert platter on the house." Elena nodded and hurried to the kitchen. Turning back to the family, Mr. Harris said, "I'll personally oversee the rest of your service tonight, and I assure you this situation will be addressed immediately." The father extended a hand. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," he said sincerely. Mr. Harris shook his hand firmly. "You're very welcome," he said. "Your family deserves the same respect and care as anyone else dining here, and I won't settle for anything less." As he walked away, his mind was already racing. Greg's behavior wasn't just a poor reflection of the restaurant. It was a failure of the values Mr. Harris had worked so hard to instill. In the quiet of the staff hallway, just out of view of the bustling dining area, Mr. Harris stood with his arms crossed. His calm yet firm demeanor belied the growing tension in the air. Greg shuffled into the space, his hands tucked into his pockets, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Harris?" Greg asked, his tone hesitant but attempting to sound casual. Mr. Harris nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, Greg, we need to talk about your behavior tonight." Greg straightened slightly, his defensiveness rising. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, though his voice wavered. Mr. Harris didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Greg uncomfortable. "I've been watching how you handled the family at Table 7, he said finally, "and I've heard enough from both them and your colleagues to know that something isn't right. So, let's start with your side of the story. Why did you treat them the way you did?" Greg shifted on his feet, his eyes darting away. "I treated them the same as everyone else," he said quickly. "If they had a problem, it's not my fault. Some customers just can't be satisfied." Mr. Harris's expression remained neutral, but his sharp eyes didn't miss the cracks forming in Greg's composure. "Is that so?" he asked calmly. "Because from where I stood, it looked like you were dismissive, slow with their service, and outright rude at times. And that's not just my observation. Your colleagues noticed it too." Greg's face flushed. I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered. "It was a busy night, and maybe I wasn't as attentive as I could have been. But that happens sometimes, doesn't it?" Mr. Harris took a step closer, his voice still calm, but now carrying a sharper edge. "Greg, let's not play games. This isn't about being inattentive. This is about you making deliberate choices that made our guests feel unwelcome, and I need to understand why." Greg hesitated, his defenses crumbling under Mr. Harris's unwavering gaze. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his frustration spilling out. "All right, fine," he said. "They were demanding. They complained about everything, the mushrooms, the timing, the food. And let's be honest, people like that are always looking for something to complain about." The room fell silent. Mr. Harris's expression didn't change, but the weight of his disapproval was palpable. "People like that?" he repeated softly, his tone dangerously even. "What exactly do you mean by that, Greg?" Greg faltered, realizing too late that he had said more than he intended. "I mean, you know," he said weakly, his voice trailing off. "No, I don't know," Mr. Harris said, his voice firm. "Explain it to me." Greg opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling to find words that wouldn't incriminate him further. Finally he muttered, "They're just different, and sometimes different people are harder to deal with." Mr. Harris let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "Different," he said slowly. "Greg, let me be very clear. The only thing different about that family is that they chose to dine here tonight instead of anywhere else. And the only thing you should have seen when you approached their table were guests who deserve the same respect and care as anyone else in this restaurant. Greg looked down, his confidence completely eroded. "I didn't mean to make them feel bad," he said quietly. "But you did," Mr. Harris said, his tone unyielding. "And the worst part is you let your own prejudices dictate how you treated them. That's not just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. Do you realize the impact of what you've done?" Greg's eyes darted up, his face pale. "I didn't think it was that serious," he said. "I mean, they'll forget about it, right? It's just one bad experience." Mr. Harris's jaw tightened. "One bad experience," he repeated. "Greg, for you, it's one night, one table. For them, this could be one more reminder of a world that treats them unfairly just because of who they are. Is that the kind of impact you want to leave on people?" Greg swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't think about it that way," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the problem," Mr. Harris said sharply. "You didn't think. You didn't consider how your actions, your words, and even your tone could affect them. And that lack of consideration, that's on you." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant clatter of dishes in the dining area. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado completely stripped away. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Mr. Harris nodded slowly, his expression softening slightly. "Apologizing is a start," he said, "but it's not enough. You need to understand that this isn't just about what happened tonight. It's about the values we uphold here. This restaurant is a place where everyone, no matter who they are, feels welcome. If you can't align with that, Greg, then you have no place on my team." Greg's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. "I'll do better," he said quickly. "I promise. I'll make it right." "Good," Mr. Harris said, "because I'm giving you one chance to prove that you can change. But make no mistake, this is your last chance. Do you understand me?" Greg nodded fervently. "Yes, sir, I understand." Mr. Harris stepped back, his commanding presence filling the small space. "Then start by apologizing to the family," he said. "Not because I'm telling you to, but because it's the right thing to do, and I expect you to mean it." Greg nodded again, his shoulders slumping. "I will," he said. "I'll do it right now." "Good," Mr. Harris said firmly. "And remember, Greg, respect is not optional. It's the foundation of everything we do here. Don't ever forget that." As Greg walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of his realization, Mr. Harris remained behind, his gaze following the waiter. He hoped that Greg's apology would be sincere and that this moment would serve as a turning point, not just for Greg, but for everyone who witnessed what had unfolded. In the quiet of the staff hallway, just out of view of the bustling dining area, Mr. Harris stood with his arms crossed. His calm yet firm demeanor belied the growing tension in the air. Greg shuffled into the space, his hands tucked into his pockets, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Harris?" Greg asked, his tone hesitant but attempting to sound casual. Mr. Harris nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, Greg, we need to talk about your behavior tonight." Greg straightened slightly, his defensiveness rising. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, though his voice wavered. Mr. Harris didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Greg uncomfortable. "I've been watching how you handle the family at Table 7, he said finally, "and I've heard enough from both them and your colleagues to know that something isn't right. So, let's start with your side of the story. Why did you treat them the way you did?" Greg shifted on his feet, his eyes darting away. "I treated them the same as everyone else," he said quickly. "If they had a problem, it's not my fault. Some customers just can't be satisfied." Mr. Harris's expression remained neutral, but his sharp eyes didn't miss the cracks forming in Greg's composure. "Is that so?" he asked calmly. because from where I stood, it looked like you were dismissive, slow with their service, and outright rude at times. And that's not just my observation. Your colleagues noticed it too." Greg's face flushed. I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered. "It was a busy night, and maybe I wasn't as attentive as I could have been. But that happens sometimes, doesn't it?" Mr. Harris took a step closer, his voice still calm, but now carrying a sharper edge. "Greg, let's not play games. This isn't about being inattentive. This is about you making deliberate choices that made our guests feel unwelcome. And I need to understand why." Greg hesitated, his defenses crumbling under Mr. Harris's unwavering gaze. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his frustration spilling out. "All right, fine," he said. "They were demanding. They complained about everything. The mushrooms, the timing, the food. And let's be honest, people like that are always looking for something to complain about." The room fell silent. Mr. Harris's expression didn't change, but the weight of his disapproval was palpable. "People like that?" he repeated softly, his tone dangerously even. "What exactly do you mean by that, Greg?" Greg faltered, realizing too late that he had said more than he intended. "I mean, you know," he said weakly, his voice trailing off. "No, I don't know," Mr. Harris said, his voice firm. "Explain it to me." Greg opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling to find words that wouldn't incriminate him further. Finally he muttered, "They're just different. And sometimes different people are harder to deal with." Mr. Harris let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "Different?" he said slowly. "Greg, let me be very clear. The only thing different about that family is that they chose to dine here tonight instead of anywhere else. And the only thing you should have seen when you approached their table were guests who deserved the same respect and care as anyone else in this restaurant." Greg looked down, his confidence completely eroded. "I didn't mean to make them feel bad," he said quietly. "But you did," Mr. Harris said, his tone unyielding. "And the worst part is you let your own prejudices dictate how you treated them. That's not just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. Do you realize the impact of what you've done?" Greg's eyes darted up, his face pale. "I didn't think it was that serious," he said. "I mean, they'll forget about it, right? It's just one bad experience." Mr. Harris's jaw tightened. "One bad experience?" he repeated. "Greg, for you, it's one night, one table. For them, this could be one more reminder of a world that treats them unfairly just because of who they are. Is that the kind of impact you want to leave on people?" Greg swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't think about it that way," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the problem," Mr. Harris said sharply. "You didn't think. You didn't consider how your actions, your words, and even your tone could affect them. And that lack of consideration, that's on you." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant clatter of dishes in the dining area. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado completely stripped away. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Mr. Harris nodded slowly, his expression softening slightly. "Apologizing is a start," he said, "but it's not enough. You need to understand that this isn't just about what happened tonight. It's about the values we uphold here. This restaurant is a place where everyone, no matter who they are, feels welcome. If you can't align with that, Greg, then you have no place on my team." Greg's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. "I'll do better," he said quickly. "I promise. I'll make it right." "Good," Mr. Harris said, "because I'm giving you one chance to prove that you can change. But make no mistake, this is your last chance. Do you understand me?" Greg nodded fervently. "Yes, sir, I understand." Mr. Harris stepped back, his commanding presence filling the small space. "Then start by apologizing to the family," he said. "Not because I'm telling you to, but because it's the right thing to do, and I expect you to mean it." Greg nodded again, his shoulders slumping. "I will," he said. "I'll do it right now." "Good," Mr. Harris said firmly. "And remember, Greg, respect is not optional. It's the foundation of everything we do here. Don't ever forget that." As Greg walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of his realization, Mr. Harris remained behind, his gaze following the waiter. He hoped that Greg's apology would be sincere and that this moment would serve as a turning point, not just for Greg, but for everyone who witnessed what had unfolded. The warm glow of the restaurant's chandeliers bathed the dining area as the family finished their desserts, the tension from earlier in the evening giving way to a calmer, more peaceful atmosphere. The young boy giggled at his sister's attempt to balance a spoon on her nose, their laughter light and contagious. The mother leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips as she watched her children. The father glanced toward the counter where Greg stood, quietly arranging napkins, his head slightly bowed, as if deep in thought. Mr. Harris approached the table with a genuine smile, carrying a small envelope in his hand. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the family warmly. "I wanted to thank you again for your patience tonight and for giving us the opportunity to make things right." The father rose slightly in his seat, extending his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," he said sincerely. "You've been more than kind." Mr. Harris shook his hand firmly. "It's the least I could do. I hope this evening hasn't completely overshadowed your time here." He placed the envelope on the table. "Inside is a voucher for a complimentary meal on your next visit. My hope is that we can welcome you back and give you the experience you deserve." The mother smiled softly. "That's very kind of you," she said. "But more than that, we appreciate the way you handled the situation. It means a lot to us." The teenage daughter chimed in, her tone light. "And the desserts were pretty great," she said, trying to lift the mood further. Mr. Harris chuckled. "I'm glad to hear that. We'll make sure to have them ready for you next time." As the family began to gather their belongings, Greg approached the table cautiously. He held a small notepad and pen in his hands, though it was clear he wasn't there to take orders. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. The family turned to him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet resolve. "I just wanted to thank you," Greg said, his voice steady but humble, "for accepting my apology and for being so gracious tonight. I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful for it." The father nodded, his tone measured. "What matters now is what you do moving forward, Greg," he said. "We've all made mistakes. It's how we grow from them that defines us." Greg swallowed hard, nodding. "I understand," he said. "I won't forget this." The young boy looked up at Greg, his earlier sadness replaced with a shy smile. "Next time, can you get my order right?" he asked innocently. Greg's lips curved into a faint smile. "You've got it, buddy," he said softly. With that, Greg stepped back, giving the family the space to leave. As they walked toward the door, the father placed a hand on his wife's back, their closeness evident. The teenage daughter held the young boy's hand, the siblings exchanging quiet jokes as they exited the restaurant. The maitre d' held the door open for them, offering a polite, "Thank you for visiting. Have a wonderful evening." As the family stepped into the crisp night air, they paused for a moment, their breaths visible in the cool breeze. The mother turned to her children, adjusting her son's scarf with a gentle touch. The teenage daughter looked up at her father. "Dad," she said thoughtfully, "do you think Greg really meant it, the apology?" The father considered her question for a moment before answering. "I think he did," he said. "But what matters more is whether he shows it through his actions." The mother nodded in agreement. "Sometimes people need moments like these to wake up to their own prejudices," she said. "It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it can be a turning point for them, and for others watching." The young boy, clutching his toy car, tilted his head. "Like how we stood up for ourselves?" he asked. "Exactly," the mother said, kneeling to meet his eye level. "Standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, can help others see what's right and what's wrong." The family began walking toward their car, their steps slow as they reflected on the evening. The father glanced back at the restaurant, its golden glow spilling onto the sidewalk. "You know," he said, addressing his wife, "tonight didn't go the way we planned, but I think it ended the way it needed to." She smiled at him, her expression soft. "And it reminded us that our dignity isn't something anyone can take away from us," she said. The teenage daughter smiled faintly, her earlier frustration replaced with a sense of quiet pride. "And it reminded them, too," she added, glancing back at the restaurant. The young boy piped up, his voice bright. "Next time, I'm getting the biggest dessert." The family burst into laughter, their spirits lightened as they climbed into the car. Inside the restaurant, Greg stood quietly at the counter, watching the family leave. Mr. Harris approached him, his hands in his pockets. "What are you thinking, Greg?" he asked. Greg took a deep breath. "That I've got a lot to learn," he said simply. Mr. Harris nodded. "We all do," he said. "But the important thing is that you're willing to start." Greg nodded, a faint sense of determination replacing his earlier regret. The story ends with the family driving away, their dignity intact and their bond stronger than ever. The warm glow of the restaurant fades into the background as the car disappears into the night, leaving the audience with a clear and resonant message. Equality and respect are the rights of every human being. It's our responsibility to ensure that no one is denied these rights, no matter where they are or who they are. As Greg wiped down a table after the family left, his mind wandered back to his childhood. Growing up in a small insular town, Greg's world had been shaped by his father, a man of stern opinions and sharp words. His father often spoke in absolutes, especially about people who didn't look like them. "They're different," his father would say during dinner conversations. "They don't belong in places like this. People like us have to stick together." Greg never questioned those words as a child. They were simply part of his upbringing, woven into the fabric of his identity. It wasn't until he moved to the city for work that he realized how narrow his worldview had been. But even then, old habits and biases lingered, shaping his actions in subtle, insidious ways. Tonight had been a wake-up call, a mirror held up to his own flaws. Greg stared at his reflection in the polished tabletop, the weight of his past pressing down on him. For the first time, he wondered if his father's beliefs had been wrong all along, and if it wasn't too late to unlearn them. As the family drove home, the father's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, but his mind was elsewhere. "This isn't the first time," the mother said softly, breaking the silence. The father glanced at her briefly, his expression heavy. "No, it isn't," he replied. The teenage daughter leaned forward from the back seat. "What do you mean?" she asked. The mother turned to look at her children, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Your father and I faced something similar when we were younger," she said. "We went to a restaurant on our anniversary, and the staff refused to serve us. They pretended they didn't see us, no matter how many times we tried to call them over." The father exhaled deeply. "We left that night," he said, "but we promised ourselves that if we ever faced something like that again, we'd handle it differently." The boy looked up at his father, his eyes wide. "Did you do it?" he asked. The father nodded. "We did," he said. "We stood up for ourselves tonight, not just for us, but for you too, so you'd know that you never have to stay silent when someone treats you unfairly." The car fell silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with understanding and strength. Back at the restaurant, Elena approached Greg as he finished his tasks for the night. "That was hard to watch," she said quietly. Greg looked up at her, guilt clouding his features. "I know," he admitted. "I messed up." Elena crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. "You did," she said, "but I think you can fix it, if you're willing to change." Greg nodded, her words striking a chord. "I am," he said. "I have to be." At a nearby table, the couple who had observed the family earlier spoke in hushed tones. "I'm glad the owner stepped in," the woman said. "That family deserved better." The man nodded. "Makes you wonder how often things like this happen without anyone noticing," he said. Later that night, as Mr. Harris locked up the restaurant, he paused to look around the empty dining room. Each table held memories of meals shared, celebrations, and conversations. For him, this wasn't just a business. It was a space where people came together, no matter their background. He thought back to his own upbringing. As the son of immigrants, he had grown up watching his parents work tirelessly in their small diner. They had taught him that every customer was family, and that respect and kindness were non-negotiable. When he opened his own restaurant, he carried those values with him. Tonight had tested those principles, but he was proud of how the evening had ended. Watching the family leave with their dignity intact reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. "This place is for everyone," he murmured to himself, the words a quiet vow, "and I'll make sure it stays that way."